Hey guys, Pastor Chad here, Pastor Allen, and thanks for joining us again for another virtual church gathering that we're doing today. Last week we discovered and talked about rest or Sabbath rest in the midst of the storm. And as we were discussing that, you might have some more questions. I know I have more questions about the ideas, like questions like what does it mean when we say presence of God in our life? What does that look like? How does that happen? What does that all play out like? We're going to today go into another story similar to our last one, where we're going to get to see the disciples in a storm again and get to see Jesus' presence with them in a different way this time.
Well, today is Palm Sunday. This is the beginning of the end of Jesus' life on earth. His earthly ministry is coming to completion. Isaiah the prophet had said that he would be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. And here he was, entering into Jerusalem and setting the stage for his crucifixion and resurrection. This is the culmination of God's plan to come to people and fulfill his purpose by making a way that people can find their ultimate rest in Jesus.
So before we go into our story and see how that whole story unfolds and teach us about this, I think we need to pause and get into the idea of God's presence with us.
Yeah, well, in Christian belief, God is a personal God, and that's how he's revealed to us in the Bible.
Yeah.
He's a personal God. He's not a far-off, unknowable deity, but he is one who loves his creation, and he enters into humanity to restore a broken personal relationship with his people and to walk through life with them. His promise is to never leave and never forsake us.
So like our story last week, we see Jesus in the boat with them. He's in relationship with them, and he's in their struggles and in their life with them. Okay, all right.
Yeah, let me bring us up to where we're going this week. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 22 and following, we will find Jesus meeting his disciples on the lake. This time, it begins this way. It says, "Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost,' they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid.' 'Lord, if it's you,' Peter replied, 'tell me to come to you on the water.' 'Come,' he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when they saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. 'You of little faith,' he said, 'why did you doubt?' And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" So the disciples were fishermen. They spent their lives working on the waters. Last week we saw the disciples in a storm with Jesus, and Jesus calmed the storm. We also saw Jonah in a storm as well, with it raging around him. Today we will find the disciples in another storm. This time, it's not about Jesus calming the storm. It's about the discovery of God's presence in the storm.
So when we start out this story, Jesus goes up onto this mountain, and it's contrasted with the disciples' situation. So when we see Jesus go up onto the mountain to pray, that has a whole bunch of imagery and a whole bunch of pictures that come with it in the biblical sense. That when somebody goes up onto the mountain, you're thinking about, well, you should be thinking about that Moses did this. He went up onto the mountain to meet with God, and that imagery of Moses going up onto the mountain to meet with God and to be in his presence then becomes imagery that's drawn into the tabernacle and into the temple system that the Israelites have. And so the temple itself becomes this like going up onto the mountain experience to be in the presence of God. And so Jesus is experiencing this Sabbath rest in the presence of God up on the mountain praying. And so Jesus is entering into the presence of God, resting with him, having this time with the Father on this mountaintop. It's a mountaintop experience for Jesus. And the disciples are in a contrasting situation. The disciples, Jesus sends them out into a dark, stormy water that they're going to find a big struggle that they're going to have to go through.
Right, and Jesus isn't aloof and far removed when he is up praying and spending time, God the Son, with God the Father. Instead, as we see in the Gospel of Mark, Mark writes and says that Jesus saw them, that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. Mark 6:48. Jesus saw their painful struggle, and that those words translated, the painful struggle, are also words that are translated as torture. That this was brutal, the strain and the stress and the strength that it took out of them over and over as they're trying to make headway in this storm. I've been to the Sea of Galilee. It's only 8 miles across. I can see the other side in my mind and the hills on the far side of the sea. Verse 25 tells us that it's the fourth watch of the night when Jesus comes to them. And according to the Gospel of John, when Jesus comes to the disciples on the water, they're only about 3 or 4 miles into the journey to get across. The wind is that tough that these men built for rowing have not been able to get across this lake. They started in the evening, somewhere 6 to 9 in the evening, and here we find them between 3 and 6 in the morning. They have been rowing for 6 to 12 hours. They have been rowing and not being able to make it across. And then Jesus comes and meets them out on the water.
So I have similar questions to what I had last time. Why in the world Jesus wait? Right? I mean, he sends them out into this thing to struggle for hours out on the water. Same question I had last time, right? Why was Jesus asleep in the boat? Did he not care? This time, why did he wait? Why is he letting them do this struggle that he's got out on the water like that?
Well, I think it would be a little arrogant of me to say that I know why God carries out his plans and does it the way that he does. But I can see parallels in this scripture to our own lives as well, and into my life personally, that it appears that God doesn't seem to help me skip over my troubles. Okay. He doesn't just skip over the trials and the pain and solve it. Instead, he seems to allow me to go through it, and he shows up in his time, in his way to accomplish his purpose in my life.
So, all right, so we've got, we don't really know why. I think you're saying we don't really know why he waited exactly. But we can learn from watching the situation, seeing how the disciples were dealing with the stress and the issue, and see how Jesus enters into this situation. So we can learn from it and not necessarily need to know exactly why.
Sure. So, back to the question, Jesus, when this passage started, he wanted to spend time with God the Father. And Jesus wants to reveal to the disciples their need, that they need this too. They need the presence of God. They need to live in the presence of God throughout all the circumstances of life. And he wants us to find the greater peace of the presence of God more than the absence or the removal of our struggles. He uses the pain to drive us, to push us to our true need, that we would find hope through rest in him.
So Mark gives us another detail, and he shares in his gospel and his recording of this event that Jesus intended to walk by them. So why would Mark say, Jesus, he was intended to just walk by? Again, it goes back to my other question.
Yep, well, that is included. It tells us that Jesus was passing by. He was passing by. And that is intended to draw our attention, as any of the original readers of this text would have known, the Jewish readers of the text, that Moses had a very similar situation where he wanted to be in the presence of God. He wanted to enter into the presence of God, and God covered him, shrouded him, veiled him as God passed by Moses. And in that event, God was revealing about his own nature and his character to Moses. And in this event, Jesus is revealing about his nature and character to the disciples. The preceding miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, which takes place just before this, Mark's gospel tells us that they didn't understand that. They didn't understand who Jesus was. But now, in this, it's going to become clear. They're going to understand who Jesus was. And so, when Jesus comes by the boat and the disciples respond the same way I would, 4 miles from land, and here comes one walking on the water, I'd be freaking out. And so they're crying out in fear. And Jesus tells them, all three gospel writers who record this tell us, Jesus' response, he says, "Take courage, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And so this is also a reference that would remind us of Moses. And significant things we learn there. In this English translation, it says, "It is I," which the Greek version would tell us, "I am." And so that reminds us of Moses in Exodus chapter 3 at the burning bush. When Moses comes into God's presence at the burning bush, and he says, "Who am I to say sent me?" And God reveals himself to Moses, and he uses what becomes his most holy name. He says, "Tell them I am has sent you." And so when Jesus is saying, "Take courage, I am. Do not be afraid," Jesus is making claims about himself that he is not only here in this storm with them, but he is the God of all creation who walked with them through all the trials through the Old Testament, and he has come. Not only does he come in the triumphal entry and in as a baby in Bethlehem, but Jesus has come right into the midst of their trials and troubles right here.
So, instead of like our other story, Jesus just calms the storm right away. This story we see other reactions to this. Peter is not gonna, he doesn't do something that I would have done. He's gonna test this guy out in the water walking by him by asking him to do something, asking him to call him out onto the water. And so he asks him to tell him to come out of the boat. And so then we see Peter getting out of the boat. It's
And when Peter steps out and he steps into the winds and the waves, the situation doesn't change. The circumstances that surround Peter don't change. And the troubles of life do not cease. They're ongoing. But Peter is now walking on the water with Jesus. He is still in the topsy-turvy waves. He feels the effects of the wind, but they don't control him. The winds and the waves do not rule Peter's thinking and his actions. He is going to be ruled and guided by his Savior, the one in whom he is trusting.
And we, as well, aren't to be ruled by our circumstances either. We have this virus that's going around and throwing our worlds into chaos, but we aren't to be thrown into chaos too. And we don't know what's going to happen next. We have people who are being affected by this. We have a girl who's in our youth group who's both of her parents are infected and are dealing with recovering and dealing with the sickness, and her grandfather suddenly died of it as well. And so we know people and are knowing more and more people who are being affected by this in our families and the people we relate to.
That's right. And we would ask you to pray for this family along
definitely.
with many others who are going through really hard times right now. I personally have two close relatives who are, they were sick, and at first it didn't seem like a big deal, but over time the symptoms developed and it was confirmed that they have the coronavirus. We have people in our church family who are laid off from work and not sure of where's the next paycheck going to come from. It's uncertain, and people are bringing home groceries, and they're like, what do I do with these groceries? Yeah. Do I have to wash each grape, separately? And how do I take care of this stuff and really protect myself and my family? And I don't really know the answer. Aside and beyond this coronavirus, why does God not take away these big pains in life? Why does he allow cancer? Why does he allow financial burdens? Why does he allow family trials and struggles? I saw a meaningful quote earlier. It said, sometimes Jesus calms the storm, and sometimes he lets the storm rage and he calms you.
So let's go back to Peter in the storm.
Yeah.
We're going to pick up in Matthew 14:30. It says, "But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, 'Lord, save me!' Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. 'You have little faith,' he said. 'Why do you doubt?'" I read these, and I'm thinking, like, unlike the last situation where these guys are freaking out and maybe they had some reason to say that, like, this time, like, I'm not sure why Jesus says he has little faith. Because I'm not getting out of the boat, right? It's still a raging storm. It's still going crazy out there. And this guy, I'm not quite sure who he is still. Peter had a lot of faith. He had some guts to get out of that boat. Why is it that Jesus was saying he had so little faith, and how can he say that in this situation as well?
Yeah, and even in that, when Peter gets out, he begins to sink because he takes his eyes off Jesus. He takes his trust off Jesus, and it still reveals that Peter's faith is fragile. Jesus was calling Peter to more. Jesus is calling us to more. He is calling us to find more than peace in the storm. He calls us to move into the presence of God, to find more than just the absence or the removal of our problems. He is calling us to step out of the safe boat and walk through the storm with him. He wants us to not be ruled by the winds and waves around us. As the passage wraps up, it says, "And when he got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" Now, they finally get what they had misunderstood earlier. What they had misunderstood about the feeding of the 5,000, what they had missed about the person and the nature of Jesus, they finally get it. Jesus is unveiled, and they see him for who he truly is. He is the Lord of creation. He is unshaken by the storm. And when we place our trust in him, we, like the disciples, can find a peace that passes all understanding.
Amen. So, this week, I want to ask us, I want to call us to be very purposeful this week. We got time to spend and be very purposeful about doing the three things that we've been talking about lately. Before all this craziness started, we were talking about these three things, and it doesn't change the importance of these three things: loving God, loving the family of God, and loving the people in the world around us. And those things don't change. So I want to be challenging us, because we gather together on Sunday morning, not just to learn some facts and cool stuff or have a discussion and go home and be unchanged. We're about trying to gather together to have a conversation, to encourage one another on in our lives. And so that doesn't change in the midst of this. So I want to encourage you guys and to do that first thing, to love God, right? How are we worshiping like those disciples in the boat? How are we understanding who God is, getting into his presence and being connected with him? So what are you doing in this weird time right now to get in God's presence? I know for us on Sunday mornings, I know Alan's doing similar stuff, but we are, as a family, on Sunday mornings are spending time worshiping. I'm putting music on. None of us are in the place where we can lead our own music and worship, but we put music on YouTube or whatever it is and play some worship, blast it, and our kids are singing along. We're dancing at the house and enjoying worshiping and getting our minds on God. But then we also are going to sit down and get in God's Word together. We use this video or the ideas from this stuff and challenge our kids to think about it and ask them questions about what they're thinking about in order to get into God's presence in order to love Him, to get ourselves focused on Him during this week. So how are you guys doing that? I want you guys to be really thinking about how are we being intentional about how are we worshiping and loving God in our life.
And not only do we want to be loving God, but we want to be loving the church family. We want to be loving those that God has put us together with as a team. And right now, it's a difficult time. We're used to gathering. We're used to coming together. We're used to
being in the building.
Yes, being in the building and seeing each other face to face and sharing our burdens together and encouraging each other and walking life together. But in these unusual circumstances when we can't gather, we still need to love the family of God. And so I've been thrilled to see how this family has been just naturally stretching out to do that. I've been calling older folks on the phone just to check up on them, and I've found that everyone I've called, 2 or 3 other people have already called them. Wow. And I'm finding that needs are being met, that everyone's being cared for, that I haven't come across needs that haven't been met yet. Wow. So it's been thrilling, and we've also been learning and discovering a lot of how to use the internet and creating virtual meetings and virtual groups. We've got virtual groups meeting all week long now, and on Sundays as well, which has been a real learning experience on how these different
people have been working hard at trying to figure out what it's like to use the internet,
how to make these programs function, and how to get people who don't use computers to be able to connect and get into the meetings with us. But it has been a joy to be able to share together in the meetings, encourage each other, and participate in each other's life in that way. We even have our prayer meeting going on Zoom on Wednesday nights, and we've really, this funny thing is some of these Zoom meetings have become larger than the group that was meeting in person, as more and more have just want to be sharing in this life together. So we've been praying for each other. We have been praying for our church family. We have been praying for those with needs. We have been in prayer. And if you're watching this video, there is a good chance that we have been praying for you as well.
Mm-hmm. So our third concept we were working on is loving the world around us. And so this week we want to be very intentional, very purposeful in how are we still loving the world around us? We're talking about that we, as followers of Christ, should have a peace that passes all understanding. That we were saying that we're able to go into the storm and just not be shaken by it. So how are you guys making efforts to bring that peace to other people in your world? I know we can't be going over to people's houses and hanging out with them in their house or having them over to ours, but it's been nice out, and we know we've been out walking and seeing people and being able to interact with them from a distance and talking. Mm-hmm. We can do that with our neighbors. We can invite them out. I don't know if you've got a front porch. We have a front porch, and we always enjoy when the weather starts getting nice. Our neighbors are hanging out on their front porch, so we get to have a conversation across our porches from each other, and we can connect with each other still. So I encourage you guys, being intentional about how to reach out over the phone, maybe even doing some of these Zoom meetings with some of your neighbors and friends to talk about what's going on, offering a helping hand to your neighbors too through this. We have a neighborhood group that's on Facebook that we talk to some of our neighbors with as well. So maybe if you don't have that in your neighborhood, maybe you start a neighborhood Facebook group that's going to be a place that you can connect with them as well. So,
well, thanks for being with us. Please like and share this post. Comment below. We want to have a conversation with you. We don't want you to just hear words, but we want to be able to enter into what are you thinking, and how are we processing this together? How are we growing from it? And we want to know about how you have found peace through the Lord Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace.